Well, thanks everyone for coming to this particular breakout session. This is our discussion of maritime gateways and inland logistics hubs, which is easy to say. My name is Jesse Kiehl. I have the great privilege of serving as a member of the Alaska State Legislature. I'm in the state Senate, and I represent an almost entirely maritime district. So we have some folks here from a variety of places and industries. So we'll talk a little bit this morning about not just ports, but how ports connect to inland hubs. And we'll talk both about infrastructure and about the human capital involved. So we have a great panel of folks today. And they're going to do, for the most part, their own introductions. I will just give you names and titles and have each of these folks put a hand up when their name comes up. We have Daniel Hersche, who is with Global Transportation Hub. Daniel is a CPA, but don't hold that against him. He's very interesting to talk to, a rare exception in his field. We have Parliamentary Secretary Paul Choi with the Government of British Columbia. P.S. Choi is also interesting to talk to, despite being a politician. We can smell our own.
I know.
We also have Mike Jacob with the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association. Mike brought slides. I don't know. We'll do our best. And then, of course, Barry Penner with Cruise Lines International Association. Barry's sitting on the end there because I have a bill the cruise industry doesn't like. I'm pushing in the legislature, so he sat as far from me as he possibly could. So rather than give you lengthy introductions on each of them this morning, I'm going to just go directly to them. They can tell you a little bit about themselves, but they'll introduce the topic and give you some of their initial thoughts. And the most important part we'll get to at the end, of course, is Q&A. So this is my chance. I'm contractually obligated to push the Whova app, which you should all have and have heard of. Put your questions in the Q&A there, and we'll get to as many of them as I deem worthy. We're going to start this morning with Parliamentary Secretary Choi. Please, if you'll lead off.
Okay, great. Mic is working. That's great. Well, good morning, everyone. It is early morning on day 2, so I appreciate everyone being here as well. And thank you, Senator, for the introduction. And of course, thank you to Penwar for bringing together leaders of government and industry sectors for Pacific Northwest. And for those who I haven't met, love to meet you one-on-one as well after. My name is Paul Choi. I'm the MLA for Burnaby South Metrotown and BC's Parliamentary Secretary for Trade, focus on international trade. And within the Jobs and Economic Growth Ministry. And it's absolutely a pleasure for me to be here today. As we know, Canada's success as a trading nation has always depended on our ability to connect with the world. And in BC, we know the role of that in our maritime gateway is something that is absolutely critical and depends on its success. BC's strong infrastructure paired with open, reliable, and growing trading relationship, along with workforce equipped with the skills to seize the new opportunities. And that's something that, as we talk about infrastructure and trade, something sometimes people forget. We can have the infrastructure, we can have the trading partners, but we need the workforce to also do that work as well. We are really proud of the ports and even airports as well, that sometimes we forget how much that plays into trade. But of course, there are so many people that work there, and we need those people to make sure that we can get work done. And those are the key ingredients to unlocking BC's economic potential. So BC plays a vital role in Canada's economy as a gateway to the Asia-Pacific region, and being on the West Coast gives us a natural advantage. And we're closer to major Asian markets than any other province, making BC a key link between Canada and some of the world's fastest growing economies. And I had the opportunity to go and visit some of those countries, and it is fascinating. And we're really fortunate how much goodwill and reputation that we benefit as Canada, as North America in general. And of course, with our rail connections, goods can reach any other parts of Canada and inland US in just a couple of days. And our ports are one of our biggest strengths. The Port of Vancouver handles more cargo than Canada's next five largest ports combined. And I heard yesterday from Port of Vancouver that they do over $1 billion worth of cargo every day. So, I mean, that is absolutely fascinating. And of course, we have upcoming Roberts Bank Terminal 2. It's a container trade capacity will be increasing by more than 30% on the West Coast, enabling trade of 100 billion in goods annually. Now, Port of Prince Rupert is growing into another of the country's largest ports. So I just want to give a quick shout out to the mayor of Mike Herb Pond, who's also here. And of course, we do have Prince George, counselor in the back as well. So thank you for being here. Our ports and its partners are executing a 3 billion construction plan now, and we're developing a new terminal and logistics project that will significantly increase BC's trade infrastructure capacity. And that's something we can all benefit, not just within the country, but US as well. And together, these ports connect Canadian businesses to customers across Asia and around the world. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that they're connecting communities. I know there are a lot of ongoing discussions about reestablishing the Alaska Marine Highway in Prince Rupert as well. And there's another reason why it's so important for Penwar to exist at a time like this. And regardless of the amount of throughout our ports in our region, ports and maritime gateways are about people, as I said. They support jobs, economic growth across the province and Pacific Northwest. And in BC, the transportation and warehousing sector employs about 156,000 people through more than 8,700 businesses. And as global trade continues to grow, BC's role as Canada Gateway to the Pacific will become even more important. By continuing to invest in our ports and trade infrastructure, we are creating jobs, strengthening our economy and supply chains, and helping Canada compete and succeed in the global stage. And through BC's integrated marketplace program, we're testing new clean technology projects as well at Port of Prince Rupert to make port operation cleaner, safer, and more efficient, including a zero-emission uncrewed vessel that monitors maritime marine conditions, sustainability, and a data tracking system on port trucks to cut greenhouse gases and enhance efficiency. So these steps are critical because recent global disruptions have shown how important strong supply chains are. Governments, industry, and labor must work together to improve efficiency, build infrastructure, and keep goods moving safely and reliably. Now, as we hear often from our trading partners in Asia Pacific, that they're looking at permanent shift away from choke points like Strait of Hormuz. We all seen that in the headline in recent days as well. We want to move towards freer movements that Pacific Ocean offers and stability and reliability that BC and Canada can offer. Now, I hope it's clear by now that BC's economy depends on trade and the jobs it supports in community across the province. And we have a very diversified export economy, as you can see. And even still, over half of BC's exports go to US, supporting workers in natural resources, technology, and agriculture and advanced manufacturing. So it's really important. Now, I'm sure we all heard about the news yesterday. It is disappointing to say the least. We are absolutely wanting to move closer to be less barrier in trade. And I think that's something we're certainly working on within our nation. And we'd love to have that for throughout North America, how NAFTA and CUSMA and USMCA was intended to do. Now, as we know, CUSMA remains the foundation of a unique North American trading relationship, and that's why maintaining stable, predictable access to market is critical. And we know trading negotiations are complex and they do take time. But what matters is maintaining momentum and continuing constructive discussions. So I firmly believe that spirit in which all of us here in Penwar are operating. So for our part, the focus is clear. secure long-term certainty for workers, businesses, and investors. And CUSMA continues to support economic growth, investments, and jobs across North America. It helps businesses and workers on both sides of the border to succeed together. And some of today's panel discussion will likely focus on those choke points. And there are physical choke points like port throughout capacity as well. Now, there are also intangible choke points like trading uncertainties, and that's something we hear over and over again from our business partners and our residents as well. Ongoing uncertainty is slowing economies down across North America. But in BC, we're trying to mitigate that as much as we can. Our government launched a new Look West economic strategy last year, and we are well on our way to securing at least 200 billion in investment for major projects for the next decade. And in line with this strategy, our premier recently secured a multi-billion-dollar agreement with Ottawa to unlock jobs for workers, securing billions of dollars in investment for major projects and vital infrastructure, skills training. That's really important for the next generation of workers, including access to affordable childcare as well. So people can train for the jobs of tomorrow and live in the communities where they work. Now, for major infrastructure projects to cutting-edge industry, we're making sure our workforce is ready. We're investing 241 million over 3 years to strengthen, modernize BC's training system to keep pace with industry needs. And this investment will help secure local talents can meet in demand in emerging sectors and seize the opportunities in upcoming online as well. And this will be critical for the maritime industrial sectors in BC, which is part of a tightly integrated supply chain that also includes producers from Alberta and elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest. And we are already home to world-class shipyards that are extremely busy. I hear that all the time talking to our ports and airports folks that they're hitting and seeing record numbers of cargoes coming through. And we also want to be a region and national hub for ship maintenance, repair, and overhaul, as well as ship recycling, covering the entire maritime life cycle. So for us to do all the things, though, there is a couple things we're continuing to work on. Of course, at Penwar, we talk a lot about north-south trade, but east-west trade can even be more complicated sometimes. We heard that sometimes where it's harder to trade with Alberta or other provinces in the country than sometimes trading with Washington. For those who attend yesterday's panel on trade, I won't repeat all the steps BC have taken to reduce interprovincial trade barriers, but we are continuing to lead and are working closely with our provincial and territorial colleagues to make sure that there are as few barriers as possible. So our ports will not be successful if there are burdens with inefficiencies caused by internal trade barriers. And if our ports are slowing down, that's the ripple effect, not only in the Pacific Northwest, but across North America. So we're committed to continuing to work with our partner to support the free movement of labor within Canada as well, making it easier for skilled workers to have their credentials recognized, will help address labor shortages and keep critical trade corridors operating smoothly. So the opportunities ahead, I think, are significant, and our ports and trade relationships, our logistical networks, and workforce are all connected. And so by strengthening cooperation across Canada and with our North American partners, we can build more resilient supply chains and support economic growth for the years to come. So I hope that to be able to touch on those points more in the discussions to come. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Maybe I could clarify on, you talked about some significant investments that the BC government is making in skills training and jobs training. Do you see the challenges in getting skilled folks in this particular sector, your maritime and your inland logistics and transportation, more challenging to find skilled folks today or comparable to other skilled parts of the labor market?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I've spoken to some shipbuilder company owners, and they said that getting the skilled workers is not too challenged. The key issue is to attract them and keep them here with a stable work that they can project out. And that's the biggest challenge. Of course, there's a lot more we can do in terms of training and the capacity to train within the province. But I heard what I heard from the message that I got was that because sometimes the lot of uncertainty is ahead, even for companies, many companies, but including ship builders as well, it's hard for them to guarantee job long term. It's hard for them to say, we got these projects lined up for the next 5, 10 years. So I'm confident I'll be able to offer you a permanent job for many, many years. They have to, unfortunately, offer them a contract or term-based or project-based. And of course, for many workers, that is not something that gives them a lot of confidence to be able to actually move their entire family and friends and their home to certain places for that particular job. So I think that's one of the challenges that we see.
Thank you. So our next presenter is Daniel Hersche. Dan is president and CEO of Global Transportation Hub based out of Saskatchewan. So we've gone way inland. Dan, the floor is yours.
Sure. See if my slides pop up or not.
See it?
Okay, perfect. So good morning. So today I'd like to briefly discuss the role of inland ports in connecting producers, industry, transportation infrastructure, and global markets, and share how the GTH contributes to Western Canada's trade corridors. Before I talk specifically about the Global Transportation Hub, though, I think it's helpful to take a step back and talk about why inland ports matter. So when people think about global trade, they naturally think about ports like Vancouver or Prince Rupert. Those marine gateways are critical to Canada's economy, but they are only one part of the supply chain. Products don't start their journey at the port. They start where they're grown, mined, manufactured, and processed. Inland ports serve as a connection point between production, transportation infrastructure, global markets, and they bring together highways, railways, industrial development, logistics services, and value-added processing in a single location. By doing that, inland ports help reduce pressure on marine gateways, improve supply chain reliability, and create opportunities for investment and job creation further inland. They also enable companies to store, process, consolidate, and distribute goods closer to where products are produced and where markets are growing. The key message I'd like to leave with you is that marine gateways and inland ports are not competing assets. They are complementary parts of a single transportation and logistics ecosystem. When ports, railways, highways, and inland logistics hubs work together, the entire trade corridor becomes more efficient, more competitive, and more resilient. So just leads me into what is the GTH. So the easiest way to summarize what the GTH is we are a Government of Saskatchewan Crown Corporation responsible for managing a 2,000-acre industrial and logistics inland port. So we are an inland port authority that operates much like a municipal authority, so with taxation powers. So we're very unique because we're both the regulator and the developer of the property, and being Canada's only self-governing inland port. So the biggest advantage that this model gives us is we can actually issue development and building permits in the fraction of the time that it takes other Canadian municipalities. So on average, industrial permits in Canada are issued in about 3 to 6 months. We're averaging less than 3 weeks. So put that into practice. Cargill just invested in a large canola crush facility at the GTH. We were able to approve their development permit in less than 3 weeks. And Cargill, who's a pretty global company, has said that's the fastest permit approval that they've ever had in the history of their company. So really proud of that. And that's kind of the power that our model gives us. A little bit more about the GTH and where it's located. So we're on the west side of Regina, and we sit adjacent to 2 major highway systems, the number 1 and number 11 highways, and we're just minutes away from the Regina's International Airport. So we're one of a limited number of locations in Western Canada served by both CN and CPKC, connecting major shipment points across North America. And beyond excellent proximity to key infrastructure like road and rail, GTH offers advantage of close access to high capacity utility services, including reliable power, robust water and wastewater infrastructure, and high speed fiber services. The connection with the Regina Bypass, which is still the largest infrastructure project in Saskatchewan's history at $1.8 billion in investment, ensures that trucks can access the GTA safely and efficiently and provides the capacity in our transportation system. The Regina Bypass is a good example of how strategic investments improve trade corridors. The benefits extend well beyond Regina. Improved safety, capacity, efficiency, and reliability all contribute to a stronger supply chain. So whether it's highways, rail infrastructure, ports, or inland logistics hubs, these investments work together to strengthen the entire corridor. A little bit more about our current status. Infrastructure is obviously important, but ultimately it's the measure of whether it creates economic activity or not. So in the last 3 years, we've made up about 80% of all industrial land sold in the Regina region at about 315 acres sold. We've had a positive impact on growth in this time period with over $1.4 billion in construction activity. And we've had a total GDP impact of about $2.5 billion since the GTH was constructed. So these results demonstrate what can happen when transportation, infrastructure, and industrial development and private investment come together. So as I wrap up, I'd like to focus on a bigger opportunity in front of us, whether we're talking about Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, Alaska, or the broader Pacific Northwest region. Our success depends on the strength of our trade corridors. The benefits of inland ports are already visible today. They support faster movement of goods, improve supply chain resilience, attract private sector investment, enable value-added manufacturing and processing, and create jobs and economic growth. At the GTH, we've seen firsthand how strategic investments in transportation infrastructure can drive significant private sector development and long-term economic activity. Looking ahead, I believe there are even greater opportunities. We can build stronger partnerships between marine gateways and inland logistics hubs. We can continue investing in transportation infrastructure that improves connectivity between producers, manufacturers, ports, and global markets. We can continue to strengthen interprovincial and North American trade, and we can create more opportunities for value-added processing and industrial growth along with our major transportation corridors. Ultimately, the competitiveness of Western Canada depends on viewing ports, railways, highways, inland ports, and industry as one integrated system. So no single asset creates a successful supply chain on its own. And success comes from building a connected network that moves goods efficiently, reliably, and competitively from producers to global markets. And that's exactly the role of inland ports like the GTH are designed to play.
Thank you, Dan. A question for you just out of sheer ignorance. You mentioned rail, but you also mentioned highways. Do you have a rough proportion? How much cargo leaves your port by rail versus truck? Spitball.
I would say probably on average, there's about 2 unit trains that leave the port every day. And then by truck, we have about 5,000 trucks leaving, I would say on average every week. So it's probably close, 50-50. Yeah.
Thank you. Helpful. Our next speaker is Mike Jacob. Mike is the president of the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association. And just so you know, you're talking to a battle-scarred veteran. Mike served many years on a county planning commission. Doesn't get tougher than that.
Thanks, Senator. Appreciate it. And thanks for having me here today. Mike Jacob. I'm the president of the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association. We represent ocean carriers, marine terminal operators on the U.S. West Coast. I'm headquartered in Oakland. We have an office in Long Beach and also in Seattle. Do a lot of work up in Olympia and really appreciate the partnership with everybody. Been invited to talk a little bit about some of the context for the conversation moving forward. Obviously, we've all been through some interesting dynamics in the trade community over the last decade. It's good to try to get, I think, a footing and a context for kind of where we sit when we're talking about all the issues that PS Choi brought up with respect to growing, investing, and moving forward with regional growth. So talk about some of these things in general. With respect to how we sit on the West Coast compared to the rest of North America is pretty interesting. If you go back to 2006, which was pre-Great Recession, and really before you had a lot of disruptions in the market space, you still had an ascendant China trade, growth post reformation of the WTO, LA Long Beach sitting obviously on the top of the entire intermodal supply chain for the entire continent. What's happened since then is you've had a real diversity of growth in different trade lanes. So if you look at the fastest growth, it's the US Southeast, Houston and Savannah, but total Canada West Coast isn't far behind. In fact, if you look until 2020, Savannah, Canada West Coast growth really mirrored each other in terms of just aggressive growth that outpaced the growth of the economy in general. And then you see on 2021, 22, 23, you see a secondary shock. So all the way on the left side, you see the Great Recession pretty pronounced. Every single market takes a dip, and then it comes back. It grows afterwards. And then you see pandemic, you see that same dip. And not everyone's come back the same way. There's obviously headwinds in the last year over what's happening with different types of tariff environments. We'll talk about that a little bit. But the biggest kind of divergence is the largest West Coast ports, Southern California, the PNW, they've gone on a completely different trajectory. So those green lines at the bottom, the light green is LA and Long Beach, Western Hemisphere's largest intermodal gateway, grown just about 25% over those 20 years. And then Oakland's flat. Seattle Tacoma has actually been down, and they're at a place where they were during the Great Recession. So a lot of divergence in terms of total growth across the entire intermodal system. And when you look at how these compare to just the economy in general, this is Federal Reserve Bank from St. Louis, just walking through US GDP. You can see that those trade volumes where you might conceptually, intuitively say these are intermodal, they reflect the full economy, they should look a lot like just general typical GDP growth. They do not. They're stratified by your trade lane, what commodity you're in, and which port you're in, which supply chains you're affected, the physical infrastructure. When Daniel was talking about the importance of building that infrastructure, it really does matter with respect to how you're able to capture and participate in that growth. And one of the ways you might look at that is not just the macro growth, but also the compound annual growth rate in these gateways. You're maybe winning if you're ahead of the compound annual growth rate, or you're losing if you're behind it. So that red line through 2022 is reflective of an average compound annual growth rate. If you look at where you are, again, Savannah, Houston, above it, trending with US GDP, Canada West Coast, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, and then US West Coast are those three bars on the bottom, obviously not trending up with general intermodal flows and growth and change in the economy. Seattle, Tacoma, and Oakland notably negative. Not good for an investor profile. If you walk in and say, where do I want to put my next dollar? And you ask them what their compound annual growth rate is, and it's negative, you might choose a different gateway to be your primary place where you put your dollar. And we can get into some of these dynamics too. Obviously, there are very, very specific dynamics within the Penn-Ware region between Seattle, Tacoma on one hand, Vancouver, Prince Rupert on the other, in terms of competition for some intermodal cargo. There's the harbor maintenance tax issue that's always pervasive in terms of some of those competitiveness issues. People point at that. It's a more complicated system. There isn't just one factor you can point at and say, this is the one tax that moves everything. And so when you look at just the West Coast, these are very, very pronounced. This is basically the same data from that first slide, but you can just see you're operating in a different market space. And some of those interactions are really important. One of them is that when you're looking at the LA Long Beach gateway for the United States, That's a principal import gateway. And we trade a lot like our total overall trade imbalance. So the trade deficit drives obviously imports into the US economy much faster than it does exports, both by tonnage and also by value. Those are important components because what you see is the gravity of Southern California and the scale of Southern California eclipsing basically everything. So there's over 20 million TEUs, which is our metric for volume that are moving in Southern California. Oakland moves just over 2. So it's about 10% of that total volume. And what LA Long Beach is doing is consolidating total volume. We're a volume business, so economies of scale matter. And when you're talking about fixed overhead, huge amounts of capital, and you're financing it over 10 times the amount of volume than someone else, your per unit cost is obviously much lower. And that drives a virtuous cycle of reinvestment. But what's happening is you're seeing when other people are growing faster, they're doing a better job at that than you are. And even if it's not your fault that you're not attracting cargo, you can be on the wrong side of that, and you're not in the virtuous cycle anymore. And it creates gravity in different places and disincentives in other. The strings that you see from ocean carriers, and they're coming in from Asia to the West Coast of the United States and Canada, is like a bus system. And they're on a route. And they'll come into LA and Long Beach first and do business there. Then they'll come up the coast to Oakland, Seattle, Vancouver. In that process, it gets more expensive when you go up the scale because you're not sitting there and adequately moving the same amount of volume per unit when you get to Oakland as you did in LA Long Beach, and then in Seattle, Tacoma, even further. And if you're on the import side, you're that much more many days removed, maybe a week later as a customer. If you had if you'd taken off your cargo, your import cargo in Southern California, you might get it a week earlier than if you stayed on the ship for the 3 or 4 days that ship has worked in LA Long Beach. Takes another day to get up to Oakland, gets worked for a day, takes another day to go up to Seattle, Tacoma, gets worked for a day, and then you have your cargo available. And so you might be paying more for a service that is available to you a week later. Not attractive to a lot of potential different intermodal folks that are maybe in Memphis or Chicago or St. Louis. Sorry, I went backwards. And this is compounded still by the exposure that you're looking at too. So when you looked at those expansions in the Gulf and East Coast of the United States versus the West Coast, a lot of it is taking over shares of trade from East Asia. That's where the growth is. That makes a lot of sense. That's where you're competitive for these cargoes that are moving through. But the exposure isn't equal either. So when you look at the changing dynamics of the trade question with the tariff situation that we're dealing with now, we're pretty obviously focusing on higher tariffs in the United States, especially on China. Who has the most exposure to China? It isn't equal. It isn't this. It's not 50-50 across all of those different gateways you saw. It's this, which is Seattle, Tacoma, San Pedro Bay, Oakland are carrying probably a larger portion of that China exposure than other ports. So when you're seeing a lot of degradation of the China trade in particular, it doesn't sit equally. And so what you're seeing is, even though it's high, before for import value share and for import tonnage share, you're at 65% exposure, you're still more than half of the market. So just in general, you're going to decline faster because you have a higher exposure to that market space at just over 55%. And then what happens in the context of that competitiveness, it gets compounded even further. So US West Coast ports, so that includes Seattle, Tacoma, Oakland, Portland, LA Long Beach, San Diego, even though they're handling a third of total US imports, you're looking at less than 10% of total US investment in the infrastructure that moves your cargo. So there's definitely a policy asynchronicity. Some might say that's purposeful. This is definitely a competitive space in terms of folks that are looking for that next dollar for the infrastructure to support their port growth. But from a national perspective, we're not reinvesting in the largest customs district that's moving intermodal cargo in the United States. We're diversifying, is essentially what we're doing. Why does that matter globally? Well, one of the things that we pride ourselves on the West Coast is our commitment to sustainability, to emissions reduction. And as a maritime industry, our members have made decarbonization a top goal. We have a net zero pledge for 2050 from ocean carriers, and we're working with the International Maritime Organization to make that a reality. One of the things that actually increases emissions is when you make the system less efficient. And we're investing in creation of supply chains that are less efficient with the diversification we were just showing you on the prior map. On average, when you move cargo through Houston, Savannah, New York, New Jersey, instead of through Seattle and Tacoma or LA, Long Beach, is that greenhouse gases on a global scale go up by roughly 20%. You're putting more time and energy into the supply chain, and you're creating less efficiency. And so we conducted this study. We've updated it once. And essentially what happens is you have to be able to sit in this global context to talk about what's happening with respect to those emissions globally. Locally, we're also very proud. I don't have a slide on this, but our emissions profile from our industry has been fantastically reduced. And by fantastically, I'm talking about we've reduced diesel particulate matter from the largest single drayage trucking fleet in Southern California and in Northern California, which is our port drayage fleet, by over 98% reduction of diesel particulate matter, near elimination of SOx, and over a 75% reduction of NOx from ships. Our cargo handling equipment is down over 90% pre-zero emissions. So when we're talking about ZE transition, and we all are, there's a tremendous amount of value from that first step. So if your port hasn't already gone to diesel particulate filters, cleaner fuel mixes, things that don't require a lot of additional infrastructure cost, they're easy to start building into your marginal cost to roll over your equipment. Tremendous amount of value. You can do that with hybridization of rubber tire gantry and rail-mounted gantry cranes, where you reduce diesel particulate matter by over 90% from baseline. And that's before you start talking about hydrogen and electric, which are all important and we need to talk about them. But they're not the only solution out there. And you don't need to go to zero to have tremendous amounts of impacts on the sustainability factor with your equipment. Once you do all that, I do want to talk about the context for the environmental piece, because people tend to look at ports, we're industrial, we're very visible, and we get a bad rap. People look at the port and they say, wow, look how dirty that is. And just want to say, in California, obviously, we're very, very focused on greenhouse gas emissions reductions from our industrial side. And the ports get pointed out time and time and again in these debates. We talk about how much we produce in terms of the economy. And therefore, there's an expectation that our environmental impact is equal to our weight on the economy. Not true. So if you look at just LA and Long Beach, largest port complex for intermodal on the Western Hemisphere, we're about 0.5% of the total contribution in the Southern California region for NOx. And that's the primary emission that forms smog. So the most localized impacts from our supply chain, the things that LA is famous for, we're about half of 1% from our cargo handling equipment. And when you look at all these other factors, you're in that same vein too. Diesel particulate matter, obviously very important to reduce because it's air toxic, so it has public health impacts. And you can see there SOx. We're usually the largest contributor to SOx by volume when you talk about the global shipping trade, because we have traditionally and historically had high sulfur fuels. We've been moving for the last 20 years out of high sulfur fuel mixes. So right now we have almost none in terms of our contribution to Southern California. So that's it. And I really appreciate the opportunity to give you some of that context.
Thanks, Mike. Great insights. Quick clarifying question. The differential in port investment, does that reflect port expansions and new capacity, East Coast, Gulf Coast versus major maintenance, West Coast, or is it apples to apples? We're looking at the same thing.
It's a great question. There's a couple different answers, and I think, this is when you talk to airport people, they say you've seen one airport, kind of the same thing. But the issue is we're creating infrastructure that's, multi-generational. You take a relatively large amount of risk and you invest a lot of capital in these, and port complexes are traditionally binary, right? You have a terminal, it's not there, then it's there. You have 0 acres and then you've got 200 acres that are operational. And so when you're financing these things over multi-decades, you tend to basically say, here's my projection for what's going to happen for the next 30 years. What can I go out to the market space as the public port or the operating port and finance and underwrite? When you get the answer to that, then you do as much as you can. So we create a lot of capacity ahead of actually having the volume. And as long as you can underwrite it, as long as you can float the revenue bond, and as long as it's marketable to a marine terminal operator, if you have a landlord operating model, that's what you do. So we do have a lot of additional capacity on the West Coast, particularly in LA, Long Beach, and Seattle, Tacoma, that are underutilized. So you have a lot of carrying capacity. You're carrying those costs with you, but they're not as productive at moving that extra dollar. Compared to some of these other ports that are growing, you're on the front end of these revenue generations. You're opening new terminals, you're growing volumes, and you're doing it smaller, being a little bit more agile. So you see a lot of apples to oranges in terms of what those total overall costs are. And I will say just US West Coast, we're almost always more expensive on real estate. We're almost always more expensive on labor. We're almost always more expensive on environmental regs. And that's okay if you're growing. But if you're not growing, it becomes a weight. And it becomes very, very hard to compete with other folks if your costs are growing faster than they are, but your volumes are.
So it's worse than I thought. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, what better time to turn to Barry Penner? Barry probably needs no introduction, but since I gave him short shrift when I first introduced the panel, I should note that Barry is a former British Columbia MLA and, more importantly in this room, a past president of Penwar. But Barry, here today with the Cruise Line Association, so please, your thoughts.
Thank you, Jesse. Attempt to get my presentation going here. Is that it?
There you go.
There. Sorry. There's the first slide. I just want to give credit to my 15-year-old daughter who helped me with the graphics on this presentation. Late one night last week when I was stumped trying to move it around, she troubleshot it for me. So that's why I want to make sure you appreciate this slide because we spent a lot of time on it.
Very nice.
So this is a great presentation, a great segue from what Mike had to say about what's happening on the West Coast with ports. Cruise, in our view, does belong in this gateway conversation because really it epitomizes the Penmore neighborhood. Really does tie our region together. Literally, it is kind of the two-nation vacation baked right into what everything we do on the West Coast with the cruise. As you can see from this slide, this is just one particular itinerary option, but I could have shown many different combinations. But this is a typical itinerary coming out of Seattle, going to Alaska. Alaska continues to be the marquee destination. It's what does draw people from around the world to the region. As a British Columbian, I was reluctant to accept that. I fought that vigorously in my early days as an MLA because I thought British Columbia should be the goal that people are coming to see. But the reality is that in the international market, Alaska has such a powerful brand, and we benefit from that. but we aren't the necessary intended destination. But that doesn't mean we're not important. It just means we have to think about ourselves, how we benefit from that, piggyback on that, and build on it. And a cruise gives the BC tourism economy, the Canadian tourism economy, the whole Pacific Northwest economy, the opportunity to introduce foreign travelers to our region the first time on a cruise ship. And studies, and we'll get to that, indicate people typically want to come spend extra time after having seen it the first time on a cruise ship. Sorry, there's a bit of a lag here. I don't know if the battery's dying. Just a bit of a snapshot of the economic contributions from the cruise industry. 2024 data. We are working on an update from 2025, but it wasn't ready for today's presentation, but it's almost there. But anyway, this is a snapshot from 2024. By this point, we were pretty well recovered from the thing we don't like talking about, the pandemic. And continued growth occurred in 2025. But you can see it's a very significant contribution to the North American economy. In the US, about $75 billion in total economic output, and over 300,000 jobs supported by the industry. In Canada, $5 billion Canadian, and more than 24,000 jobs across the country. And as we'll see here, it's a future slide, sorry. Here we kind of break it down by some of the component parts in Penwar and the job contributions. I know the font is small. Washington State, we're looking at almost 12,000 jobs. British Columbia, close to 12,000 jobs. And Alaska, again, similar number, about 12,000 jobs supported from the cruise industry. And that is in 2024. And as I said, we saw continued growth in 2025. So I'm waiting for those updated numbers. When you talk about the cruise industry from a Canadian perspective, it's really the West Coast. Not to say the East Coast isn't important, it is growing, but about 2/3 of cruise industry activity occurs on Canada's West Coast, and that's Vancouver, Victoria, and Prince Rupert primarily. There are the occasional cruise ship stops in Campbell River or Nanaimo, and this year Port Alberni was happy to welcome back a cruise ship or two. And there's continued opportunity for growth in those other ports. And I think Mayor Pond would be correct if he pointed out that Prince Rupert saw growth in 2025, and I think more growth again this year. So when we get the updated slides, you'll see that line for Prince Rupert moving further to the right. And here's the thing I was trying to get to is 69% of passengers stay at least one night before or after a cruise. Surveys that are conducted of passengers when they get off a ship indicate somewhere around 60% indicate a desire to come back. That's certainly the case in the city of Victoria, for example. I should have pointed out that Victoria is Canada's largest cruise port in terms of port of call, and then Vancouver is the largest home port. Of course, they're doing the turnaround, 7-day cruises primarily to Alaska. Of course, there are cruises that depart Vancouver for other jurisdictions, so all across the Pacific at different times of the year, or down the West Coast to California. And just on the ripple effect from the cruise passenger spending and the cruise industry spending, all the procurement that takes place really does ripple across the country. I did not pull the numbers. I did run out of time, but there is data about impacts in Saskatchewan that occur right across our country due to the supply chains that are required to service the cruise industry. One of the things, and Paul, you were talking about the shipyards and so on in British Columbia, and also I want to point out that Vigor Shipyard in Seattle and Portland also is in the cruise refit business. This is something that Seaspan in Vancouver and Victoria has had a major role in. Speaking personally, not on behalf of the Cruise Line Association, but my personal goal has always been to see this sector grow. I think, Paul, there's a great opportunity with the continued focus to build this sector for the Pacific Northwest. Much of the cruise ship refit business happens in the Bahamas, or in Spain or in Singapore. But I think we have a great opportunity to continue to grow that work here on the West Coast. Just outside of Victoria's Esquimalt, and it has the largest dry dock on the West Coast. So that's a kind of a unique asset that we have, and I think we need to market that more. When I say we, I think governments collectively. And then this is a comment pointed at the federal government. We saw in Canada, we saw a major decline in cruise refit work in Victoria and Esquimalt and Vancouver because our federal government in Canada started making it more difficult for qualified technicians to come and do the work that's required on these turnarounds. This work has to happen according to a very strict schedule. You can't fool around with waiting for permits to get people in. Of course, the government officials would say, well, why aren't you hiring local workers to fix the Marconi radar system? Well, because that violates the warranty. The warranty requires that the actual Marconi technicians from Italy come and perform the work on the ship. And for some reason, a few years ago in Canada, suddenly the federal government decided that was a problem. And immediately, Vigor Shipyard picked up the slack. We literally saw refit work move to Portland. So that was a gain for the United States, but that was a self-inflicted wound. So the desire to make sure that these 6 or 10 technicians were from Canada instead of Italy meant we lost 800 jobs. I'm not that good at math. I'm a lawyer, not a mathematician or an accountant. So I'm not very good at math, but even I know that 800 is better than 6 or 12. So it's a kind of a personal frustration, as you can tell on my part. We've overcome much of that, but there's continued to be government regulations layered on top of what is a very competitive industry. And so last year, I spent a lot of my time on behalf of the Cruise Line Association trying to convince our federal government that Parmesan cheese was not effectively radioactive. All of a sudden last year, we had our Canadian Border Services Agency, in my view, misinterpreting guidelines from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, expressing concern about Parmesan cheese that was from Italy. And so that, it sounds funny, but extremely costly and serious consequences if you care about the environment. Because the result was everything that came off the ship then could not be recycled. It had to go into landfill. And not just any landfill, it had to be deep landfilled by 3 meters deep. So that means wine bottles, plastic bottles, cardboard, plastic was deemed high risk because there was Parmesan cheese from Italy on board the ships. And so we had to work to overcome that. And these types of things do accumulate in terms of reputation. So kind of a message to legislators. The cruise line business is a competitive business. They're facing stiff competition from land-based destinations and resorts. And when you think you could just keep layering on ridiculous rule after ridiculous rule, and it has no consequences, that's incorrect. So anyway, I'm happy to say we were able to reverse that. But there continues to be, it's always another thing coming. So just to keep that in mind, if we want to attract more of this kind of work and jobs and benefits to our West Coast, we have to be smart with our regulation. Just a little snapshot of what's been happening here, the growth that we've been seeing. I said, of course, we all know that thing we don't like to talk about that happened in 2020 and 2021. We've largely recovered from that and moved on, but it really did illustrate when that stopped what the value was of having it. So for those people who become complacent about the contribution that the cruise industry provided to our economy and jobs for young people in the summer and so on, you sure saw how important it was when it wasn't there. And I'm happy to say it's bounced back and continuing to grow. So just a few kind of points in addition to what I mentioned, just about trying to be smart about our regulations. We continued, when we were asked by government officials in Ottawa, for example, what are your priorities? We continue to support investment in port infrastructure. For example, shore power, got a brief mention here, but that continues to be an opportunity. And I harken back to my time as Minister of Environment and going down to meet with then Governor Schwarzenegger and having a tour of the Port of Valley Long Beach and being impressed to look at the what they called at that time called cold ironing, but we call shore power, allowing cargo ships and cruise ships to plug in to the local grid and turn off their engines burning bunker fuel or diesel fuel. And I was very keen about that because at that point Vancouver did not have that capability. And so the governor said to me, look, if you're actually interested in this, we'll give you the engineering drawings for free, all the work that we've done to design this, but you have to promise you're going to use it or we're not going to give it to you. And the idea was that we would continue to compete on cost and efficiency, but we would not compete on the basis of lower environmental standards on the West Coast. The idea was to link arms and kind of have a uniform approach on reducing emissions and getting better environmental efficiency, and continue to work together on that front, but still be competitors, but try to cooperate where we can. And that just made nothing but sense. So it was a great day when the Port of Vancouver did, for the first time, just before the 2010 Olympics, get shore power installed, and joining Seattle and Juneau and San Francisco and then LA and San Diego in the ability to have ships, when they're at berth, turn off their engines and rely on electricity to run the systems on board those ships. And I know I should shout out the Port of Vancouver has recently announced that they have additional funding from the federal government, and they're putting in their own dollars to expand the number of berths in Vancouver that can provide electricity at shore to cruise ships. So you can read these points as well as I can on the screen, I hope. So these are some of the other things that we kind of bring forward as our message to decision makers. Thank you.
Well, first, a round of applause. Thanks to our panel for their insights. The first question I want to pose is one from the audience that matches up with one I had in my notes to prepare. And Barry kind of led us into it nicely. I was going to ask each of you about what bottlenecks you see that ought to be loosened, or alternately, if there's a situation of overcapacity or oversupply that ought to be consolidated or shrunk down that affects either your industry or our port to inland pipeline collectively. So Barry, I think you actually identified a couple. Anything else you want to add on that topic? Something further?
Yeah, I'm just formulating a thought here. I need one more cup of coffee to complete the process. The high level discussion does unfortunately filter down and impact. So, I mentioned the concern last year around Parmesan cheese, and this year there's been some other things. I think certain type, was it yogurt or something from France? Cheese, blue cheese maybe? Anyway, well, in talking at the local level, we're talking about the people who actually walk on the ships and do the inspections and looking at what's been FDA approved, or in Canada, CFA approved. Those are human beings, and it's become apparent to me that they are influenced by this broader discussion. So unfortunately, this trade irritant between Canada and the US, and the commentary that comes from a certain elected leader in the United States saying we don't need anything from Canada and you should be the 51st state. I hear that reflected back at times in the tone, and I do sometimes wonder if that does influence how individual inspectors conduct themselves. I sometimes pick that up, that there's a little bit of resentment because the cruise industry is seen in Canada as bringing mostly US people to Canada. About 80% of the people getting on a cruise ship are not from Canada, in Vancouver, for example. So some of the staff may be carrying a bit of a grudge, and that's just maybe a microcosm of the bigger picture, that words matter. And so it behooves all of us in our region to continue to try to collaborate and focus on the prize, which is this, whether it's trade, inland ports, workforce development. The bigger prize is we're stronger together. And And words that divide are not particularly helpful. And it does make, my job, for example, more difficult in trying to navigate a successful season for cruise passengers.
The point is very well taken. And I should also point out that, it's long been known there are tremendously high background radiation levels in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And I'm not going to be able to maintain this doughy physique if you guys start applying that standard to the chocolate flow. So let's just, you're right, Barry. We'll cut that off right here. Mike?
It's such a great question. Harkens back to a lot of lessons learned from the pandemic. Obviously, we had a lot of disruptions to supply chain, and I think the main takeaway for the entire intermodal system was the need for additional resiliency. We have a system which primarily is privately financed, privately funded, privately operated, and when you do that in its just-in-time environment, you don't build 110% of the warehouses you don't need. You don't build 110% of the chassis you're not using. You're using, 80, 90% of your capacity all the time. And so there's less of an incentive to build capacity just in case, because you don't need the system to finance stuff you don't use. And so one of the takeaway lessons from the pandemic was we need more robust conversation about building in buffers, building additional infrastructure that's upland from the ports and ports of entry, including inland ports, including additional warehousing space, having additional rail and truck capacity. And we've done a really, really horrible job of implementing our lessons learned. We still have driver shortages. We don't have a whole bunch of additional new potential skilled labor that's being developed. We haven't built the warehousing capacity that we need to actually build those things. We haven't created a lot of different public additional subsidies for things like rail, intermodal, and other types of activity that would allow you to have those resiliency components built into the system. And then we have like I said, unfortunately, the opposite problem on the intermodal side, primarily, which is we have unused capacity in a lot of places where we don't need it. The good news is the market's still turning. And despite all of the headwinds with tariffs, where you would expect that there would be a lot of changes on the demand side that change the supply side equation, our members are looking again 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years for some of these concessions for their terminal developments. So we still have a lot of long-term demand. The expectation that somehow the economy is going to stop growing, or somehow that there's going to be volumetrically less trade than there is right now. If you think about what we're looking at in the intermodal space is not just that tariffs reduce volume, but tariffs move volume around. They change the way that it grows. You're going to have spikes and valleys that aren't in line with your traditional business cycle, but the consumer demand hasn't gone away in North America. If anything, by a lot of respects, it's larger. So we've seen some real spikes in productivity. We've seen a lot of spikes in creativity, and those have also basically resulted in higher volumes at places you wouldn't expect them. So it's lumpy, but I think the long-term proposition is we still need to get back on applying the lessons learned from the pandemic, building in system capacity beyond what just the private sector would finance on a day-to-day level.
Dan?
I think he covered most of the points, but if I was just to build on it, I still think there's some labor challenges, especially in trucking and even just on ports and kind of across the whole system. And then I think there's still investment needed in infrastructure to build that resiliency. And I still think there's some work to do around collaborating with between port to port, how we operate with, ports in BC versus how they're getting goods to and from Saskatchewan. Like, we're a big export province, obviously, but I think that we can still build up export more goods from Saskatchewan, working with counterparts in BC and kind of across the Western Canada for sure. And so there's a lot of work to be done. Infrastructure to invest in, especially I would say on the rail side, to move goods more effectively, more efficiently out of the ports. So I still think, going back to one of your earlier slides, like I think cargo waits around in our ports longer than it needs to, and we need to utilize inland ports more effectively, get goods out faster instead of waiting to fill up a certain unit train just to its end destination, when you can just create more volume and get it out of your ports faster. So
Thank you. Parliamentary Secretary, you mentioned provincial investments in education and in childcare. Others have talked about skilled hands. The U.S. number for the skilled trades we hear too often is for every 5 folks who retire, 2 folks come in. And I'm hearing maybe not the same number, but a comparable dynamic on your side of the border. In addition to your investments in education and training, in addition to your investments in childcare, what are you seeing as potential bottlenecks that we could loosen, or areas where there's overcapacity that's inefficient?
Yeah, since everyone already touched on like physical bottlenecks and stuff like that, I'll focus on a bit of like a policy side of things from provincial government side in BC. We discussed briefly about the fact that there is trade barriers between provinces. And when I speak to international partners, that's a very unknown concept in certain countries as well. Because they said, I've been here, you barely notice when you drive across provincial line. What I mean, there is some sort of barrier. I didn't see any barrier. So it is something that we've been working on and perhaps haven't focused enough until recent years when there was more desire to do so. Because we have to know that from a investor perspective, if they manufacture, let's say, tires, and if they're looking to invest in North America, in BC as an example, and they want to set up a factory here, scale of economy matters. And if whatever tire that they produce, they can only sell within the province, it may not make much sense comparable to if they can produce one product that they can sell across the country and even throughout the North America. That makes it more competitive. That makes it more attractive for them to come and invest in our continent. So for our perspective, we've been working really hard to be able to remove those barriers. And of course, there's been more desire than ever to do so. And we've seen that in last year, we were able to get all the provinces, territories together for a Canadian mutual recognition agreement to remove as much barrier as we can. There's more work to do. And of course, we also introduced Trade Recognition Act within our province to make it and make sure that goods can flow back and forth. It's funny how Barry mentioned about Parmesan cheese. We certainly do recognize when we have that discussion, food is something that's most sensitive, and we get that. The policy and the rule regarding safety of keeping food safe in BC, for example, you can sometimes get quite hot, go up to 35, 40 degrees compared to, let's say, Yukon, will be a little different. And people's feel for food and the rules around it is something that we find a little more sensitive. So there's a lot more work to be done there. But that's sometimes it's those removing red tapes is the work that we need to do. And that's the sort of feedback we hear from some of the investors that's looking to invest into North America.
Thank you. We'll shift direction just a little bit on the conversation here. We had a couple of questions come in from the audience about alternate fuels, new fuels, and I'll combine a couple of them together and ask each of you to talk a little bit about what you see as the potential, the need, and realistic time horizons. So we had a question about hydrogen-fueled locomotives for trains. questions about LNG or green methanol for ships. And I'll just open it up. Who'd like to kick us off with your viewpoint on time frame? Is it realistic to begin with? What are we looking at? Barry.
I'd love to talk about that because I was just sitting here thinking I failed to mention that we are now for the first time bunkering ships, cruise ships out of the port of Vancouver with LNG. Not all cruise ships, but some. Last summer was the first year that we were able to provide liquefied natural gas from British Columbia and Alberta, liquefied in British Columbia, south of Vancouver at Delta, I think it is.
Yeah.
The Tilbury plant that Fortis has, and a specialized ship operated by Seaspan. I think it's called the Garibaldi, the ship, picks up the liquefied natural gas, goes around into the harbor of Vancouver, pulls up alongside cruise ships and refuels with liquefied natural gas. So that is a near-term fuel that is starting to become a bit more readily available in the West Coast, that can see up to a 20 to 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but a much more dramatic reduction in SOx and NOx and other criteria pollutants, somewhere up to 95% or more reduction in those other pollutants that have a direct impact on human health, a direct and immediate impact on human health. So there's I think, considerable opportunity to expand the role of that fuel. And the cruise ship industry, I think it's somewhere around 25 to 30 ships now that are in operation around the world are capable of operating on LNG. Primarily, you're seeing it in Europe, operating in Europe. There's greater availability there in terms of sourcing the fuel. But now Miami is capable of providing LNG to cruise ships. And on the order book, the majority, I better not say, I've got to check, but a significant number of new builds are planned to be built with LNG capable engines. The benefit to that is then it's easier to modify the ships in the future if other low carbon fuels become available at scale, like methanol, or some people still hope for hydrogen. I'm not quite as optimistic about that from a feasibility perspective. But for other low carbon fuels, if the engines are designed to operate on LNG, I'm not an engineer, but I understand it's easier than to convert to operate on these other fuels. So it is a bridge fuel to even lower carbon, but you do get some immediate carbon reductions. And it has the benefit of supporting the industry in British Columbia and Alberta, where a lot of our natural gas comes from.
Yeah, build on that for the container liner industry. Our new builds are almost all now trending towards dual fuel. So they'll have the capacity to burn traditional diesel fuels, but also either burn LNG, ammonia, or methanol. That is the primarily, largest chunk of our new order book. World Shipping Council, if you're interested in this, has a dashboard that shows you over time how many more of these ships are coming in on the order book that are dual fuel. The Far East and Europe and the US Gulf Coast have done a really good job of positioning themselves for all of these fuels. They're very, very positive on building the infrastructure quickly to support those ships. Kudos to Vancouver for actually getting some LNG out there for vessels that are available to do it. You get to the US West Coast, it's a desert. So if you are trying to fuel up in LA, Long Beach with LNG, we have a couple of carriers that try to do it. They truck that in from the desert. There is no local production facility for ammonia, methanol, or LNG, no terminals to actually deliver to a ship, no distribution network in California or in Washington State, despite the fact that if you talk to folks in both those states, they really, really want to have you use those fuels for decarbonization. And then the other challenge for that is we have made it as an industry, we've made a commitment to full net zero 2050 from the container shipping industry. So we are making those investments now. They're multi-billion-dollar investments, and the fueling infrastructure needs to follow. There's absolutely no question that it's going to take longer to build the infrastructure to support the industry than it's going to take the industry to build the ships. That's why they're dual fueled, so we can still use any type of capacity for the diesel market that exists in whichever port you're in, wherever you are in the world. But we will not be deploying dual fuel ships in the Trans-Pacific trades if the largest nodes aren't amenable to the fuels. So they'll stay in the European trade, they'll stay in Far East, other places besides Pacific West Coast. And that's just the way that that's going to go until we catch up with the infrastructure. So we need much, much more. We ran a bill in California asking our California Energy Commission to start planning for the development of those fuels. It was vetoed by the governor, who wanted to take a regulatory approach to the fuels before a planning approach to creating the fuel. Totally backwards, but it's very similar to a situation we see evolving in Olympia, which we're hoping to address this next session and push on the planning side and the investment side for alternative fuels first. And then I'll just leave with one other quick issue, which is in the US, our Clean Air Act is not sophisticated enough to be balancing out different types of fuels or different types of air quality impacts when you look at what a criteria pollutant that you monitor is and what you manage for. So we basically ask everyone to do everything for every type of emissions, except for carbon. And given the dynamics of DC right now, there's even less of a focus on carbon than there was before. So we have some serious mismatches there. But if you look at the fuel mix of what we're committing to as an industry, it is decarbonization. Not all of our fuel mixes are going to play well with the Clean Air Act, which means if you're building ammonia or methanol, or in the short term LNG before you transition to bio LNG or other types of things, you will actually probably be in a situation where you're actually increasing NOx. That's a no-no under the Federal Clean Air Act in the United States. If you participate in a vessel slowdown, either because it's good for whales and in earlier versions of your engine, it was good for the air. When you slow down tier 3 vessels, which are the newest, cleanest ships that we have deployed, your NOx goes up. So a lot of places where we are aligned with win-wins with, cetacean management and safety and clean air, because we've created these new technologies and got more efficient, you actually have trade-offs now you didn't have before. So those areas are going to get more complicated. But in the meantime, the best thing we can do is start investing for the cleaner fuels we know we need to decarbonize.
So sorry to interject, but I just have to say, Paul, I hear opportunity knocking.
That's right.
The desert that was described on the West Coast for LNG provision for ships.
Yeah.
My understanding is that C-SPAN is now built or ordered 4 vessels to carry LNG to then refuel ships with.
Right.
And Fortis, BC, I wear another hat. I chair something called the Energy Futures Institute in British Columbia. They have a desire, they see a market opening to export LNG, to expand their Tilbury plant near Vancouver, and put it on board the C-SPAN ships and go down the West Coast.
Please do.
To provide the bunkering capacity of LNG. They see a window. They already have a liquefaction facility at Tilbury, right on the water. And so on behalf of British Columbia, I see opportunity knocking.
Absolutely. And I was fortunate enough to visit the site and see the work that they're doing ongoing. And they're building out the capacity and seeing how they can take it, freeze it, compact it, and then ship it and out, and which is really interesting. Just to build on that, on LNG, it's something that is already there. And what we've seen is around the world, it's deemed to be a high quality, cleaner LNG than other products out there as well. So what I will say is and the feedback I got is that Canada and US is not never, but for the most part, not going to be seen as the cheapest option. And I don't think we want to compete at that sort of market. When you say it's made in Canada, it's made in US, it has a very high reputation. People trust it with high quality, and that's what it is with LNG as well. A lot of countries around the world absolutely have air quality issues. I'll say I moved from Korea, and when I moved, we were amazed how clean and fresh air tasted like it. You really feel like you can taste the air. It's so much cleaner and fresher. And there are a lot of places around the world. Korea is one of the examples, China, Japan, where you can't really go outside anymore and breathe without having some sort of mask and some sort of device because you go outside for 20, 30 minutes, you come back and you blow your nose, you're gonna see black particles, and they are really focusing on, and they have to turn their minds to how can we have energy that is clean, and that's where we see a lot of traction and desire for Canadian products as well. One thing I'll build on that is I'm really fortunate. The riding that I represent in Burnaby South, there's so many innovative companies doing amazing things. One of that is carbon capture technology, where besides about this room, they have this new technology. It's essentially a big filter air cleansing system. They can put that in the middle of a city, and it will, I think they said it's equivalent of having 1 million trees of capturing carbon and turning it into fresh oxygen. And those are something that's really fascinating that we're seeing that's coming down the pipe. And there's another company that retrofits gas trucks and cars with hydrogen engine and different technology with it. And if we can, they're rolling it out now. And right now, it makes sense for big trucks like ambulance, big buses, those sort of specialized cars that's harder to replace. If they were to buy it brand new, they have to spend a lot of money to retrofit it inside. So then it makes sense for them to take the car they have and retrofit it with hydrogen engine. So they get a brand new engine, but they have a low emission hydrogen car that they can run. We can see that as well as it evolves, being part of more of infrastructure and supply chain to have a more cleaner ways to transport the goods back and forth.
Well, Dan, I want to give you the last opportunity before we get out into the Edmonton air, which you can also chew today. But please, your view on alternate fuels, cleaner fuels, and their prospects. And
maybe I'll just focus on the trucking industry just in the prairies. So I would say if there is an alternative fuel source, most likely the trucking industry seems to be leaning towards hydrogen. Similar to what you were talking about, you can do engine conversions. It's still quite expensive. So for an average truck, it'd be almost $100,000 to put in a new engine. The other barrier right now too is infrastructure. So I would say it's early days, but I think as we figure out more technology, there's more hydrogen availability. I think that's something that we'll probably see in the next 10 years start to pick up momentum in the trucking industry specifically. So I really think hydrogen is most likely the fuel source that will be used in that industry moving forward.
hydrogen unit trains, 10 years more?
I would say this like the same. It could be. I would say that that's probably the availability to make it and convert the type of like trains and other things is more readily available to do that. So,
And I should point out that Penwar secured a grant and completed the work a year ago, maybe it was 2 years ago now, on a hydrogen source study here in our region. And so we have been able to help as an organization lay some groundwork that industry hopefully will use to move forward in that arena. With that, I managed to bring us in only 60 seconds over time. Please, if you would join me in thanking Dan Hersche, Paul Choi, Mike Jacob, and Barry Penner for their work.